In the mountains of northern Okinawa, the June rains seeped endlessly from the rock faces, mixing with the rotting soil into an acrid smell. As Takashi Yamamoto dragged his injured leg and retreated through it, he could no longer tell whether he was withdrawing or being slowly swallowed by the battlefield. He was a lance corporal in the Japanese army, 27 years old, raised in the rural fields of Kyushu, and before conscription his hands had only touched the wooden handle of a plow. He had never imagined that one day, 2,000 kilometers away from his home, he would be making a final, futile struggle for the Empire's defeat. The roar of flamethrowers closed in from the cave entrance. He knew that to continue hiding meant only death. In the end, amid smoke and scorching heat, he was forced to raise his hands. In that moment, he did not feel the so-called shame. He only felt his chest cavity become light, as if scooped empty. In the extremity of exhaustion, letting go of resistance felt more natural than continuing to live. When the American soldiers bandaged his wounds and carried him out of the cave, fine rain was still falling on the burned slopes. Takashi's vision was blurred, yet he could still clearly hear those English commands he did not understand. They were neither insults nor torments, but merely mechanical procedures. Precisely because there was no malice, a deeper kind of panic rose in his heart. Propaganda had said the Americans were cruel and bloodthirsty, that they would skin and torture their captives, yet these men only laid him on a stretcher and gave him water to drink. He even felt that this gentleness was more dangerous than bullets. Hatred is simple. It is kindness that leaves people at a loss. Escorted to the shore, he saw large numbers of prisoners gathered in neat ranks awaiting embarkation, their faces wearing the same bewilderment. He was placed aboard a transport ship, and in the returning sea wind he realized for the first time that he was leaving the battlefield, leaving the Japanese homeland, leaving behind everything his training had told him was the spirit of the Imperial Army. Yet the sea wind was so clean, as if it had never heard the words Gyokusai, honorable death, like a shattered jewel. Only defeated soldiers have a future. That sentence would surface again and again in his mind in later years, though he did not dare acknowledge it until much later. After crossing the ocean, the destination was not some island in the Pacific, but the American mainland. When they arrived, the rows of neatly parked trucks, warehouses, and loading machinery on the dock filled him with an immense sense of strangeness. He had never seen material distribution on such a scale, never seen food stacked on the ground by the ton, like industrial products. In that moment, Takashi did not know what it meant to be an industrial nation, nor did he understand the term productive capacity. But the scene before his eyes was like a great fissure, splitting his old world cleanly in two. On his first entry into the POW camp mess hall, Takashi's steps were so stiff it was as though they had been fixed in place. He held his metal tray and watched the food fall onto it in sequence. Sliced bread, hot soup, meat, firm potatoes, and chocolate cake carrying a sweet aroma. He had never imagined that cake could be food for prisoners. He had also never imagined that the bitter fragrance of coffee could linger in the air for so long that it became a kind of everyday background. Canned fruit was gently tapped open, making a crisp sound as it was poured into bowls. Back on Okinawa, he had gone weeks without seeing a single real piece of fruit. In the caves, he and his comrades had once fought over a blackened sweet potato, the struggle like beasts tearing at each other. Faced with this abundance of food, what he felt was not surprise, but a sharp, painful sting. What he truly could not bring himself to approach were the small, brightly colored candies neatly laid out for the taking. He had never seen this kind of packaging. Transparent outer wrapping, vivid inner paper, neatly pressed edges, and a tear line whose location he could not discern at all. He stood there in a daze, his fingers rigid, not knowing how to deal with these foods. Many prisoners casually grabbed one or two pieces and popped them into their mouths. Others, finding them too sweet, simply stuffed the candies straight into their pockets. You must not eat the enemy's candy. Takashi repeated this sentence in his heart. Yet the other half of the truth was that he simply did not know how to open that layer of candy wrapper. Not being able to was, to him, more shameful than not wanting to. His fingers were stained with dirt and blood, while that wrapper was clean, smooth, faintly glossy, like a fragment of civilization he could not reach. He pushed all the sweets on his tray into a corner and ate only the most basic potatoes and bread. The taste of the coffee was like coal smoke, and he refused to touch it. The American guards around them did not pay much attention, merely standing at the mess hall entrance chatting, occasionally glancing over to see whether the prisoners were behaving. That unintentional ease unsettled Takashi even more. He could not determine his place in this world. He was no longer a soldier, no longer an enemy, not yet a civilian. He was a defeated man, and a defeated man had to rely on a thin layer of stubbornness to keep some shape amidst the chaos. Days flowed slowly by in a rhythm of labor and 3 meals. Takashi was assigned to the light duty group in the warehouse area, responsible for moving ration crates, sorting canned goods, and unloading sacks of flour brought in from the Midwest along the railway sidings. Each day he watched a scene he had never previously been able to imagine. Train after train, pulling in. Truck after truck, driving through. Warehouses filling with canned food, flour, tobacco, coffee beans. The POW camp's food supply seeming to have no end. He even saw batches of canned goods discarded directly in the unloading zone because of minor packaging defects, while only 50 meters away, the kitchen could still prepare fresh meals for the prisoners at any time. It was a kind of power that did not rely on shouts, flags, or marching songs, but on factories, railways, machines, and numbers. For a lance corporal from an army plagued by extreme material scarcity, this kind of power was more despair-inducing than artillery. Sometimes he would watch American soldiers pass by, casually take a piece of candy from their breast pocket and toss it into their mouths. The motion was so natural, it invited envy. Most American soldiers' jackets were tidy, their leather boots supple, their belt equipment light yet sturdy. Even the lowest-ranking recruits carried more on their bodies than a Japanese company commander could hope to have. Shock came first to Takashi's eyes, followed by avoidance. He was afraid that if he stared too long, he would end up acknowledging things he was not supposed to admit. Yet he still stubbornly clung to his refusal, especially toward candy. It was not that he had never known hunger, nor that he did not want to try it. He simply knew that once he accepted it, he would no longer be able to lie to himself with the phrase, "We are just as strong as America." Many forms of persistence are not born of willpower, but of fear of collapse. The true turning point came on a cold morning. Autumn had deepened. The wind in the warehouse area was sharp, and because of malnutrition and long hours of carrying loads, he suddenly felt darkness sweep across his vision and collapsed to his knees. The fellow prisoners beside him reached out to support him but had no strength. An American guard ran over, helped him sit on the steps, and took a small piece of candy from his pocket. The very kind Takashi had always been afraid to touch, then placed it in his hand. The American soldier said nothing, only made a simple gesture with his fingers. He located the tear line along the side of the wrapper and gave it a gentle tug. The folded seam opened with a small pop, like a petal unfurling. The motion was clean, brisk, and natural, as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. Takashi's throat tightened. He realized that for the first time he had refused not because of the candy itself, but because he did not know how to open the wrapper. He lowered his head and held the candy in his palm. The sheen of the wrapper quivered faintly in the sunlight. He no longer knew what exactly he was holding on to. He only felt that a thin layer of self-respect was being gently touched, yet had not shattered. That night he sat in a corner of the barracks while the other prisoners murmured softly among themselves. He quietly took out that piece of candy and searched inch by inch for the tear line, but never quite found the right angle. The wrapper slipped between his fingertips, a softness that seemed to refuse his approach. He was on the verge of giving up when a prisoner from Hokkaido noticed his movements and said in a low voice, "From the fold here. Pinch the edge first." It was not sympathy, nor pity. It was simply one defeated soldier sharing an ordinary little skill of everyday life. At last the wrapper slid open, and the sweetness surged from his tongue toward his chest like a warmth he had no defenses against. In that instant he suddenly understood that what he had been refusing was not sugar, but the admission that the world was no longer as simple as the Japanese War Ministry had told him. The more easily the wrapper came apart, the more deeply his old world split open. Sometimes change does not begin with surrender, but with tearing open a small piece of paper. The narration settles this line softly here, as though writing a footnote for the entire story. From that day on, Takashi did not transform all at once. He remained cautious, remained reserved, but he no longer pushed sweets away. At breakfast, he began to pour himself a little coffee. It tasted bitter, but it warmed his hands. On holiday meals, he would eat a small bite of chocolate cake, and when canned fruit was handed out on quiet afternoons, he no longer slid the bowl aside. He did not celebrate these changes, and no one demanded that he acknowledge anything. It was simply that he had learned to reach a certain reconciliation with this world. Yet he always remembered that single moment in his heart, the sound of the wrapper being gently torn open, like a door quietly swinging ajar. As the weather gradually turned colder, the POW camp's routines began to show a kind of sense of order Takashi had never experienced before. On the day American guards distributed winter clothing to the prisoners, he watched from the warehouse doorway as boxes of coats, boots, gloves, and blankets, all sorted by size and number, were stacked in neat rows. There was even a clear procedure for replacing damaged garments. The prisoners queued up in turn, registered their numbers, and received their clothing, each item clean, free of lice, and without patches. When Takashi was handed a set of winter wear, his fingertips could feel a density of weave he had never known before. It was unlike the paper-thin, national defense-colored uniform he had worn on Okinawa, which turned into a layer of cold mud when wet, but something solid and warm, as if truly designed for the purpose of staying alive. The first time he put it on, he felt an unfamiliar sense of shame. From birth until conscription, he had been taught that austere living is a virtue and endurance is an honor. Yet they had never truly protected him. Now, what gave him warmth was not the empire, but the enemy. He looked up and saw the American guards standing nearby, also wearing winter coats, but theirs were made of thicker material with sturdier seams. Their boots rose an inch higher than those given to the prisoners, with extra reinforcement around the ankles. In that instant, Takashi felt as though he was standing on the threshold of modernity, allowed to stretch only half a foot across it. The prisoners received enough, while the American soldiers enjoyed abundance. This layer of difference was everywhere, like the air itself, seemingly not cruel, yet impossible to resist. Wars are not won or lost by endurance, but by factories. At this moment, the narration delivers a cool, measured line, giving a heavy annotation to the essence of the scene. One evening, in the barracks corridor, Takashi saw several fellow prisoners sitting together, breaking their bread into pieces and pouring warm coffee over it, stirring carefully. That was a kind of snack popular in the camp, turning hard bread soft and fragrant, like a miniature dessert. Such an improvised recipe could exist only in an environment where food was stable, continuous, and not scarce. As he watched the quiet satisfaction on their faces, it was not greed he saw, but a calm expression that said, for now, "We do not have to be afraid of starving to death." Takashi did not join them. He merely stood at a distance, yet for the first time, no feeling of contempt rose in his heart. Life in the POW camp was not easy, but it shattered the structure of the world he had once believed in. Slowly he began to realize it was not eating the enemy's food that stripped people of dignity. It was the refusal to ever accept anything new that imprisoned them in the past. A few weeks later, the camp began preparations for Christmas. American soldiers put up simple decorations along the mess hall walls, and some of the guards arranged a special holiday meal for the prisoners. In Takashi's memories, the Japanese army had never celebrated holidays for its soldiers, especially in the final phase of the war, when holidays meant death notices and even harsher rations. Here, however, a holiday meant a special meal, an extra slice of cake, and a can of pineapple that would not normally be given to prisoners. The first time he bit into the canned pineapple, the sweet tart flavor almost made him dizzy. He thought of himself in the caves of Okinawa, gnawing on fire-smoked strips of dried sweet potato, scraping mush from grain sacks soaked by rainwater in order to fill his stomach. As he swallowed that single piece of pineapple, a certain defensive line in his heart shifted outward, if only by an inch. That night, under the dim light of the barracks, he wrote a short diary entry. He hid his pencil under the bedboard, a stub he had chanced upon in the warehouse, one of his few private possessions in this world. He wrote, "I once believed food was a weapon. Now I understand that food is order." It was the first time he had used words to touch a nearly forbidden thought. Perhaps the enemy was not the chaotic barbarian depicted in propaganda. Perhaps their strength came from a different national structure, not from some supposed moral decay. A few days later, during a routine work detail, he and other prisoners were taken to clear out old supplies in a sheet metal shed. Beside a pile of wooden crates awaiting disposal, he saw several worn American army coats, some buttons missing, yet still made of sturdier material than the prison uniforms they had been issued. The American supervisor nearby noticed their gaze and said lightly, "These are discard." The tone was not boastful, merely factual. It was precisely that lack of intentional showing off that struck Takashi in the chest like a heavy blow. On Okinawa, Japanese soldiers could quarrel bitterly over a single intact pair of boots. Here, clothes thrown away by Americans were better than what Japanese elite units had ever worn. In that moment, he suddenly understood a truth the Japanese War Ministry had deliberately concealed. This war was not a contest between soldiers, but a gap between industrial systems. From that moment on, he no longer needed anyone to tell him who would ultimately win. The answer was already written in every pair of shoes, every coat, every can of fruit. That night, he lay awake for a long time. The wind howled outside the windows, and in the barracks he could hear the faint sounds of prisoners turning over in their sleep. He reached for the scrap of candy wrapper by his pillow, the thin piece of paper from the first candy he had ever managed to open. For reasons he could not quite explain, he had kept it. In the dim moonlight, it gave off a faint sheen, like something that had quietly nudged the course of his fate. Sometimes, the truth of a nation is hidden in its smallest objects. Here the narration adds another line, as if reminding the viewers that history is not written only by treaties or battles, but by countless tiny textures. By the early spring of the following year, as the weather grew warmer, Takashi's strength had recovered significantly during his work in the warehouse. He became more adept at moving crates, loading and unloading trucks, and even began to chat softly with his fellow prisoners during midday breaks. He no longer regarded American food as an insult, but as resources for survival. He had gone from being a refuser to a cautious learner. The first time he deliberately took a piece of candy onto his tray, he no longer waited for someone else to demonstrate how to open it. Instead, he used the now practiced motion to gently tear the wrapper apart. It was not an act of surrender to the Americans, but a recognition of reality. One windy afternoon, he saw a young, lanky American soldier in the distance, unloading new cases of food in the warehouse yard, his movements efficient and fluid, a piece of candy tucked in the corner of his mouth. As he worked, he casually flicked the empty wrapper toward a trash bin. The gesture was effortless, as if it were an organic part of daily life. Takashi watched that light scrap of paper twirl twice in the air before dropping into the bin, and a strange feeling rose suddenly within him. Their sweetness does not come from sugar, but from a world that is stable. The narration delivers this line softly, as if speaking aloud the understanding that had long been buried in Takashi's heart. And it was on that very day that he realized for the first time. His past beliefs had not been smashed by the enemy. They had been dissolved by reality itself. When the late summer winds of 1945 swept over the camp roofs, Takashi sensed a peculiar tension spreading through the air. The American guards were quieter than usual. The loudspeakers occasionally emitted news fragments that were quickly cut off. The distribution of canned goods in the kitchen shifted slightly, and trucks began to shuttle more frequently through the warehouse yard. It was as if the entire camp were waiting for some unspoken announcement. Then, one afternoon, several American guards gathered together, speaking in low voices, and one of the soldiers finally could not help murmuring the word, A-bomb. Takashi did not understand the specifics of what they were saying, but the heaviness in their tone made his stomach tighten. He did not know what was happening in the outside world. He only knew that the air was changing. A few days later, the camp commandant came to the main yard. A sweeping gust of wind tipped his cap slightly askew. He lifted a loud hailer and, in an extremely steady voice, announced, "War is over." The war had ended. The words echoed in the air like a stone thrown into a still lake, each ripple altering the course of someone's life. Takashi's mind went blank. He did not know whether that sentence meant victory or defeat. He only knew it meant that he would never return to the caves of Okinawa again. Around him, the prisoners were silent at first, then suppressed sobbing began to spread. Some men knelt down, some covered their faces with both hands, some whispered their mothers' names. Takashi did not cry. He only drew in a long breath, and that breath felt like the first time he had inhaled air that truly belonged to the future. Sometimes, peace does not arrive like a sunrise, but like a fall. The narration lays down this line lightly, gathering together both the shattering and the release of that moment. In the weeks that followed, subtle changes came over the camp. The Americans began to reduce armed patrols, opened more areas for prisoners to walk briefly, and some were allowed to tend small gardens within the compound or sweep fallen leaves. Under the arrangement of an American chaplain, simple prayers were even held. The barbed wire that had once symbolized imprisonment now, after the coming of peace, felt more like a guardrail. It protected them, allowing them to wait for repatriation within a safe, controlled frame. In his diary, Takashi wrote, "Peace is stranger than battle." It was not an exclamation, but a statement of fact. For those who had walked out of war, silence itself felt like a question. The repatriation lists were posted in early September. Each page of names looked like fragments of identity being carefully reassembled. When Takashi found his own in the middle of the third page, he stared at that small line of characters for a long time. He had once fought in the name of the Empire, yet could scarcely remember where he had departed from. On the battlefield, he had lost his name, his family, his hometown, and now he was to return bearing the label of a prisoner of war. On the day he boarded the ship home, the sea wind carried a strange chill. Standing on deck, he watched the camp recede into the distance. The mess halls, warehouses, and barracks that had once felt so humiliating now revealed themselves as the most orderly and safest period of his life. He remembered the first set of warm winter clothes issued to him, his first cup of hot coffee, the first time he tore open a candy wrapper, those tiny fragments like a series of markers, leading him from the old world into a new one. The body was what had been imprisoned, the mind was what had been released. This line of narration falls amid the sound of wind, as if drawing the final stroke over the chapter of the POW camp. When the ship reached a Japanese port, the sight along the shore nearly robbed him of breath. The warehouses in the harbor had been reduced to skeletons, the tracks blanketed with rust, and distant neighborhoods looked as though some giant beast had torn the roofs away. Newspapers fluttered among the ruins, and in puddles lay the reflections of broken utility poles. Children, dressed in clothing cut from burlap sacks, searched for food along the streets. A young mother crouched by a wall, feeding thin rice gruel to an infant whose mouth barely opened. Takashi stood motionless by the iron rail of the pier. He had believed he had already seen the worst the world could offer. Okinawa's heaps of corpses, the humiliation of the POW camp, the dread of sea transport. Yet the ruined country before his eyes made him realize the camp had not been disgrace, but survival. Here, freedom means hunger, and imprisonment once meant food. The narration does not hesitate to lay down this sharp line of reality. The road back to his hometown was like passing through a landscape of scorched memories. Takashi crossed bombed-out bridges and walked past empty shopping streets where children turned over rubbish heaps in search of anything edible. People looked at him with expressions hard to read, part pity, part suspicion, part a reluctance to ask about his past. His identity as a former POW hung on him like a shadow he could not remove, as if invisible hands were brushing lightly against his back wherever he went. He tried hard to find work. In the first few months, he carried cargo on the docks, trading his labor for meager pay and ration coupons. Later, he labored in makeshift construction sheds, sawing planks, hauling sandbags, patching roofs. His body quickly adapted to the work, but there was a place in his heart that remained unfilled. In the camp, he had relied on sweets to sustain his strength. Now in his homeland, even an ordinary piece of candy had become a luxury. Then, one day, American aid supplies began arriving at the port in a steady flow. While helping unload cargo, he noticed a glint of light flash from the crack of a wooden crate. He pried the box open and found row upon row of familiar little candies neatly arranged in cardboard compartments. They were the very same kind that had once appeared in the POW camp: transparent outer wrap, bright inner paper, clean folds, and a tear line almost invisible to the naked eye. For half a second, Takashi's breath stopped. He reached out to take one, and its familiar sheen seemed to have traveled from some night-long past into his hand. Standing by the clamorous dock, trucks honking, workers shouting, ships coming in, he heard all those sounds recede at the edges of his awareness. He lowered his head and looked at the candy as if seeing another version of himself. The young lance corporal in the corner of the barracks, clumsily pinching a wrapper, his fingers trembling with nervousness. Using the motion he had learned back then, he gently pinched along the fold and pulled outward. The wrapper split open with a crisp sound. The candy lay quietly inside, like a tiny kernel of truth. He placed it on his tongue. The sweetness spread slowly, no longer laden with the shame it had carried in the camp, but with a calm, unmistakable flavor. He suddenly understood that it had taken him a whole year to learn how to tear open a candy wrapper, and a lifetime to comprehend the world that lay beyond that thin layer of paper. At this moment, the narration delivers the most crucial line of the entire story. Some nations are defeated by weapons. Some people are torn open by reality. Then, the tone softens. And in the year he learned to tear open a candy wrapper, the world also taught him to understand the future anew. Later, Takashi opened a small coffee stall near the harbor, selling cheap American-style coffee and simple homemade cakes. He kept a jar of candies on one corner of the counter. When children came to buy the rough coffee ground biscuits he made, he would slip a candy into their bag and casually tell them, "If you don't know how to open the wrapper, I can show you." The children usually tore it open in one quick motion, and he would stand quietly by, watching for a moment. It was not because of the sugar, but because they were far more fortunate than he had ever been at their age. In Japan, more than a decade after the war, the cities gradually began to regain their shape. There were more storefronts with bright, clean windows, children in neat school uniforms, and office workers hurrying to and from their jobs. Life was being pieced back together from the rubble, bit by bit. Takashi often stood at the door of his tiny coffee stall, watching the young people pass in front of him. Their satchels were clean, untouched by rainwater, and their faces bore a sense of safety he himself had never known in his youth. The wooden sign of the stall had been weathered by the rain. He would gently sand it down and apply a thin coat of varnish. A few simple pastries were laid out on the table, and beside them a glass jar held dozens of candies he made sure to buy extra when restocking. He did not keep them for sale, but for children who could not afford desserts and yet were reluctant to give up the taste of sweetness. One dusk, a thin boy came to buy a cheap coffee biscuit, clutching his coins so tightly that his palms were slick with sweat. Takashi glanced at him, placed the biscuit in a paper bag, then took a candy from the glass jar and dropped it in. The boy froze for a moment and whispered, But, I didn't pay for this." Takashi smiled faintly and pushed the bag toward him. "It's for you," he said. He paused, then added quietly, "If you don't know how to tear the wrapper, I can teach you." The boy nodded, ran to a wooden bench beside the stall and sat down. He cradled the candy wrapper in his hands, hesitating for a long time before trying to pinch along the fold. Takashi walked over and crouched beside him, teaching with a patience that bordered on solemn. "Here, a little pressure. Don't rush." The wrapper split open with a soft pop, and the boy's eyes lit up for an instant. Takashi smiled. In that moment, he suddenly realized that the motion which had once filled him with boundless shame and difficulty in the POW camp had now become a way of passing on happiness. The skill he had learned from the enemy's supplies could now be taught to a child on a peaceful street. He refused candy back then because he was afraid to admit that the world was larger than he had imagined. Here the narration lets this line fall slowly. Now, as he hands the same candy to the next generation, He is telling them that the world will not shrink because you refuse it. It will only grow wider when you understand it. The setting sun dropped toward the end of the street, bathing the wooden window of the coffee stall in a sheet of gold. Children's laughter echoed at the mouth of the alley, and scraps of candy wrapper danced lightly in the wind like tiny, shimmering feathers. Takashi stood in that play of light and shadow, a man who had lived in two different worlds and had finally found his place. He seldom spoke of the POW camp, seldom mentioned Okinawa, and rarely recalled the days when he had refused all sweetness out of shame. Only late at night would he take out that old candy wrapper he had preserved for so many years and lay it gently in his palm. It had faded, turned fragile, yet still bore that small tear from long ago. It marked the first time in his life he bowed his head to reality, and the first time he lifted his gaze toward the future.